What if the outcome of the most terrible war in history had been decided not on the battlefields, but deep behind the front lines? In the summer of 1941, when the army was retreating and the enemy was advancing on the capital, Stalin launched an unprecedented operation. Thousands of factories, millions of people, and the entire industrial might of the country were loaded onto trains and sent eastward into the unknown. It was a desperate race against time, under bombs, in chaos and cold. It is an incredible story of how the heart of industry was torn from the flames to beat again and forge the weapons of victory. By the summer of 1941, the Soviet Union was a colossal industrial power, created in less than a decade and a half. The forced industrialization of the 1930s, carried out with incredible human effort and enormous sacrifice, had a dual purpose. Officially, it was to build socialism. Unofficially, but quite obviously, it was to prepare for the coming Great War, the inevitability of which was no secret to the Soviet leadership. The directives that defined the five-year plans invariably emphasized the paramount importance of developing the defense industry and related basic industries. In the east of the country, in the Urals and Siberia, a so-called second main coal and metallurgical base was deliberately created, which was to become a backup for the traditional industrial centers of Ukraine and the European part of Russia. It was there, deep into the continent, that some production facilities began to be relocated and strategic reserves created even before the war. Shortly before the German invasion, there was an active accumulation of reserves, non-ferrous and precious metals, grain, and fuel. At the same time, labor laws were tightened, effectively tying workers to their enterprises, and a system of labor reserves was created that allowed the state to send people where they were most needed, rather than where they wanted to work. All this was part of total mobilization preparations. However, despite these large-scale preparations, the idea of preventive evacuation of industry from border areas to the interior of the country did not find support among the top leadership. There is evidence that as early as the end of 1940 and the beginning of 1941, some military and government officials noted the transfer of some equipment and skilled personnel to the east, which could be regarded as a covert, limited evacuation. But these were only isolated, scattered measures. When, in April 1941, a memorandum was submitted to Joseph Stalin proposing the development of a plan for the partial evacuation of the population of Moscow in the event of war, his reaction was sharp and unequivocal. His famous resolution was left on the document. To P.P. Pronin, I consider your proposal for a partial evacuation of the population of Moscow in wartime to be untimely. I request that the Evacuation Commission be disbanded and that all talk of evacuation cease. If and when it becomes necessary to prepare for evacuation, the Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars will notify you. This resolution reflected the general attitude of the time: faith in the power of the Red Army, and confidence that, if war did break out, it would be fought with little bloodshed on foreign territory. The very idea of having to rescue factories from Kiev, Minsk, or Leningrad seemed alarmist and defeatist. Tension hung in the air, but it was saturated with official propaganda about the indestructibility of the Soviet borders. The storm was already on the horizon. The clouds were gathering, but the country, at the behest of its leader, continued to look westward with a menacing and self-confident air, unwilling to prepare for retreat. This refusal to plan the evacuation in a timely manner would be one of the reasons for the catastrophic losses the country would suffer in the first months of the war, and would make the subsequent operation to save the industry even more heroic and incredible. June 22, 1941, 4 o'clock in the morning. This moment split the country's history into before and after. The Barbarossa Plan, carefully developed by the German General Staff, was put into action. A huge military machine, unprecedented in history, assembled from all over Europe, descended on the Soviet Union. The first hours and days were filled with chaos, confusion, and desperate attempts to understand the scale of what was happening. Reports flying into Moscow from the border regions were fragmentary and contradictory, but their overall message was terrifying. Cities were burning, airfields had been destroyed, and the enemy was rapidly advancing deep into Soviet territory. Confidence in the impregnability of the borders evaporated, replaced by shock. Hitler was convinced that the colossus with feet of clay, as he called the USSR, would collapse within a few weeks. And in the first months, it seemed that his calculations were proving correct. By the end of summer and the beginning of autumn, German troops had occupied territory that had been home to about 40% of the population before the war, and accounted for about a third of the country's industrial capacity. The most important industrial centers were captured or threatened with capture. Belarus, with its developed machine-building industry, Ukraine with its coal mines in the Donbass and metallurgical giants, and the Baltic states. Every day brought news of the loss of another city, another factory. It was not just a military disaster, it was an economic collapse. The country was losing not just territory, it was losing steel, coal, electricity, machine tools, factories that had been built over decades of incredible labor. The realization that without urgent, unimaginably bold measures, the war would be lost in a very short time came slowly and painfully. Initially, there was no clear, pre-prepared plan for the evacuation of industrial enterprises on a national scale. The decisions that had to be made were born in the heat of the moment, dictated by desperate necessity. The first attempts to remove equipment were spontaneous, organized on the spot by plant managers and local party officials, often without authorization from the center. It was chaos, in which heroism was mixed with panic. Some tried to dismantle and remove anything of value under fire, while others, following pre-war instructions, destroyed equipment so that it would not fall into enemy hands. In this atmosphere of total disorganization and the rapidly approaching front, decisions had to be made that would determine the fate not only of the army, but of the entire state. The question was extremely tough. Could the Soviet Union, having lost its most developed industrial regions, continue the war? The answer to this question depended on whether it would be possible to achieve the impossible, to snatch the heart of its industry from under the blow and make it beat again, thousands of kilometers from the front line. In the midst of the chaos and retreat of the first days of the war, when the very structure of the state seemed to be falling apart at the seams, the Soviet leadership made one of its most crucial and fateful decisions. On June 24, 1941, just 2 days after the invasion, a decree was issued to establish the Evacuation Council under the Council of People's Commissars of the USSR. This marked the birth of an emergency authority that would lead an operation unprecedented in world history to relocate the productive forces of an entire continent. The council was headed by Nikolai Schwernik, and his deputies were people whose names would forever be associated with this titanic undertaking. including Alexei Kosygin. The council was given virtually unlimited powers. It could issue orders to the people's commissariats, transport organizations, the military, and local authorities. Its decisions were binding and had to be carried out immediately. It was a mechanism created to counter the German blitzkrieg with the Soviet system of total mobilization and planning. A week after Germany's attack, a tough mobilization plan for the national economy for the third quarter of 1941 was developed and approved. This document, along with the Council's evacuation orders, became the roadmap for the Great Industrial Relocation. The first thing to do was to get things under control. They had to figure out what to save, where to take it, and how to do it. Priorities were set with iron ruthlessness, dictated by military necessity. First to go were defense-related enterprises, aircraft, tank, and weapons and ammunition manufacturers. These were followed by related factories that supplied them with components and enterprises in basic industries such as metallurgy, chemistry, and power engineering. Orders were also given to remove strategic reserves of raw materials, food, cultural treasures, and, of course, skilled workers, engineers, and technicians along with their families. Decisions were made quickly. Lists of enterprises to be evacuated were drawn up and approved in a matter of hours. Often, the fate of a giant factory that had taken years to build was decided by a single line in an order. Factories that could continue to operate and produce goods for the front were kept running until the very last moment. Their dismantling and removal often began when street fighting was already underway in the city, and enemy artillery was firing on the factory grounds. Anything that could not be removed, stationary equipment, power stations, mines, was to be destroyed or rendered unusable. The Evacuation Council became the brain center of the operation, which, despite the incredible pressure of circumstances, was able to turn a spontaneous flight into an organized strategic retreat. It was not a battle for territory, but for the future, for industrial potential, without which any army, even the most numerous, was doomed to defeat. And in this battle against time, chaos, and the advancing enemy, the Evacuation Council became the headquarters where the economic foundation for future victory was forged. The order was given, the mechanism was set in motion. But now, the Evacuation Council and the entire state were faced with a question of enormous complexity. What exactly should be saved first? Resources, especially transport, were extremely limited. Every car, every locomotive was worth its weight in gold. A wrong decision could cost thousands of lives at the front. Therefore, priorities were set with cold, almost surgical precision. The slogan, "Everything for the front, everything for victory," became not just a propaganda cliché, but a cruel principle of selection. At the top of the list were aviation industry enterprises. The Soviet command understood perfectly well that the war of the 20th century was a war of engines, and whoever dominated the air had a decisive advantage. More than 100 aircraft factories were evacuated, including all enterprises producing Il-2 aircraft and frontline bombers. Design bureaus such as the Ilyushin and Yakovlev design bureaus were also among the first to head east. The tank industry followed. The tank became the main weapon of land warfare, and the loss of tank factories would have been tantamount to defeat. Key tank manufacturing facilities were saved and moved from Leningrad, home to the famous Kirov plant, from Kharkov, where the tractor and locomotive plants operated, and from Stalingrad. Their new home became the Urals. The third most important priority was the production of weapons and ammunition, from artillery guns to cartridges. Factories producing gunpowder, shells, mines, and rifles were evacuated without fail. These purely military industries were followed by those without which they could not exist. First and foremost, this was metallurgy, especially enterprises specializing in the production of high-quality armor steel. Next came chemistry, machine tool building, and electrical engineering. The selection process was dramatic. Directives from Moscow demanded that the most valuable and modern equipment, machine tools, machines, and mechanisms be transported first. Often, old units had to be left behind to make room in the trains for newer ones. It was possible to completely relocate the equipment of military, machine building, and chemical enterprises. The situation was much worse for the extractive industries and power plants. Their massive and stationary equipment was mostly left behind for the enemy. In Belarus, for example, the Mogilev aircraft plant and the Khrushchevsky cement plant were completely evacuated, but much had to be left behind. More than 16,000 units of valuable equipment were taken out of the Republic. But this was only a fraction of its industrial power. The giants Zaporizhstal, Dnipropetrovsk, and Koksohimzavod were successfully evacuated from Zaporizhia, but much of what could not fit into the trains was blown up or rendered unusable. It was a ruthless triad: evacuate, work to the last, or destroy. Every factory director and every local party leader was faced with this choice, and their decision determined whether the front would receive the much-needed tanks and aircraft in a few months' time, or whether the enemy would get hold of the most valuable equipment. The Great Resettlement of industry was not just a matter of moving machines and equipment. It was, above all, a tragedy and a feat of millions of people. Behind the dry figures and reports and orders to transport so many tons of cargo, to evacuate so many enterprises, stood real human destinies. Workers, engineers, technicians, and their families became the main characters in this epic story. For them, the evacuation started with an order that came out of nowhere. Yesterday they were working and making plans for their lives, and today they were told that the factory was moving. Where to? They often weren't told. They were given only a few hours to pack. They were allowed to take only the bare essentials, a bundle of personal belongings. Everything else, their homes, furniture, possessions accumulated over years, was left to the mercy of fate and the advancing enemy. The most terrifying and heroic stage was the dismantling. It took place in conditions that are difficult to imagine. Factories that continued production until the last moment often found themselves in the line of fire. The dismantling of equipment took place to the accompaniment of shell explosions and the wail of air raid sirens. The enemy could see clearly what was happening and deliberately bombed and shelled the factory grounds in an attempt to disrupt the evacuation. Every day, people were wounded and killed, but they continued to work, rushing to save their factory, which had become their second home. Women and teenagers, who replaced the men who had gone to the front, worked alongside adults, performing the hardest physical labor. They dismantled machines, loaded them onto platforms, and carried parts and tools on their backs. It was a labor front no less dangerous and important than the battlefront. After dismantling, an equally painful stage began: loading into trains and a long journey to the east. People and equipment were often transported in the same freight cars, known as teplushki. Dozens of people were crammed into a car with no heating or amenities. Next to them stood precious machine tools covered with tarpaulins. The journey could last weeks or even months. The convoys were constantly subjected to enemy air raids. The trains traveled mainly at night, spending the day on sidings, camouflaged in the woods. There was not enough food, and people were starving. But even in these inhuman conditions, they maintained discipline and order. One of the main tasks was to keep the equipment complete. The trains were organized so that each one, or even a group of cars, could turn into an independent production site once they got there. Engineers and technicians traveled with their machines, knowing every screw, and their job was not only to get there themselves, but also to deliver the equipment safe and sound. It was a mass resettlement of peoples, organized according to the laws of wartime. Tens of millions of people were torn from their homes and thrown into the unknown. Their personal tragedies, their sacrifices, and their incredible labor became the price the country paid for saving its industry and, ultimately, for its future victory. The relocation of more than 2,500 industrial enterprises and between 17 and 20 million people, thousands of kilometers to the east, was a logistical operation unprecedented in world history. It was a real challenge for the country's transport system, especially for the railways, which were already operating at full capacity in peacetime. Now, they had to cope with a double burden: meeting the needs of the front, transporting troops, equipment, and ammunition, while simultaneously carrying out a gigantic evacuation program. The Trans-Siberian Railway and other railway lines leading to the Urals, the Volga region, Western Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia became the main arteries of the Great Resettlement. The entire country turned into a huge railway station. Trains carrying equipment, and people flowed continuously from west to east. Trains carrying troops and weapons for the front flowed from east to west. Managing this gigantic two-way movement required incredible organization and discipline. About 1.5 million rail cars were needed to transport all the evacuation cargo. This is a colossal figure. Often there were not enough rail cars, and they had to be waited for, which led to a buildup of equipment ready for shipment in the open air at stations, turning them into ideal targets for enemy aircraft. Railway workers operated in wartime mode. Train drivers drove trains for days without rest, under constant threat of bombing. Repair crews restored tracks and bridges destroyed by air raids in a matter of hours. Every train was of special importance. Dispatchers worked miracles, directing military and evacuation trains, finding windows in the schedule to let trains with the most valuable cargo pass. One of the most important rules that they tried to strictly observe was to keep cargo complete. This meant that the equipment of a single workshop, or even an entire factory, was loaded onto one train or a group of trains running one after the other. This was critically important for the rapid deployment of production at a new location. Once the train arrived, there it was, a ready-made workshop that could be assembled and put into operation. To achieve this, incredible tricks had to be used. For example, heavy machine tools were loaded onto platforms, while lighter parts and tools were loaded into covered cars of the same train. The equipment was accompanied by teams of workers and engineers who dismantled it and had to assemble it at the new location. They knew their equipment down to the last screw and were responsible for it. There were days when as many as 800, 900 cars loaded with equipment and materials left Zaporizhia alone. And there were dozens of such Zaporizhias all along the front line. The routes were long and dangerous. From Leningrad, enterprises were transported along the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga, and then by rail. By the end of November 1941, almost 500 large enterprises had been evacuated from Moscow and the surrounding region, requiring more than 100,000 rail cars. This transport feat, accomplished in conditions of war, chaos, and severe resource shortages, became the basis for the success of the entire evacuation campaign. Without the selfless work of the railway workers and the precise organization of traffic, the heart of industry, torn from the combat zone, simply would not have reached its new home in the East. Among all the evacuated industries, the story of the rescue of the tank industry stands out. It became a symbol of the entire operation and gave rise to one of the most famous concepts of that war. Tankograd. This unofficial name was given to the city of Chelyabinsk, which became the heart of Soviet tank building. Before the war, the Chelyabinsk Tractor Plant, CTZ, produced civilian goods. But with the outbreak of war, it was instantly converted for military needs. Soon, trains began arriving in Chelyabinsk, with equipment and specialists from other tank giants across the country that were under threat. The main migrant was the Kirov plant in Leningrad, one of Russia's oldest and most powerful industrial enterprises and the cradle of heavy tank building. Its evacuation from the blockaded city was a real feat. Equipment and people were transported across Lake Ladoga under constant bombardment. The second giant to find a new home in the Urals was the Kharkov Locomotive Plant, KLP, which, together with the Kharkov Tractor Plant, KTP, was the center of production of the legendary T-34 tank. Its evacuation also took place under extremely difficult conditions, literally from under the noses of the advancing German troops. A great merger took place in Chelyabinsk. A single industrial complex was created on the basis of the Chelyabinsk Tractor Plant, officially named the Kirov Plant of the People's Commissariat for Tank Industry in the city of Chelyabinsk. But the people immediately nicknamed it Tankograd. Other smaller enterprises related to tank building also arrived here. Work began on a scale and at a pace that were beyond imagination. The equipment arriving in the trains was often not even taken to the buildings. It was assembled directly on foundations prepared in the open air and immediately began to produce. Walls and roofs were then erected around the machines that were already in operation. People worked 12 to 14 hours a day in the bitter Ural frost, living in hastily erected barracks and dugouts. But the result of this selfless work exceeded all expectations. Just 33 days after arriving at the new location, the first trains with equipment from Kharkiv arrived, and Tankograd began production of the T-34 tank. It was an absolute record. Not only were the machines transported from Leningrad and Kharkiv, but more importantly, the design bureaus, engineers, and master craftsmen were also brought over. This human resource potential made it possible not only to restore production, but also to continuously improve combat vehicles. It was in Tankograd that heavy KV and IS tanks and self-propelled artillery units, which became formidable weapons of the Red Army, were developed and put into production. Tankograd was not the only center. In Nizhny Tagil, at the Uralvagonzavod plant, mass production of the T-34 was also launched. In Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, the Uralmash plant manufactured hulls for tanks and self-propelled guns. The Urals became the country's armored fist. By the spring of 1942, when German intelligence reported to Hitler that Soviet factories in the east were producing 1,000 tanks a month, he refused to believe it, saying that it was impossible. Intelligence was indeed wrong. By that time, Soviet industry was already producing 2,000 tanks a month. This flow of armored vehicles, born in evacuation, played a decisive role in the battles of Stalingrad and the Kursk Bulge, determining the outcome of the entire war. If tanks were the armored fist of the Red Army, then aviation was its eyes and striking sword. Realizing this, the Soviet leadership gave absolute priority to saving the aviation industry from the very first days of the war. The operation to relocate aircraft factories and design bureaus to the east was one of the largest and most successful parts of the entire evacuation campaign. In total, more than 100 aviation industry enterprises were transported to the east. These were not only assembly plants, but also factories producing engines, components, instruments, as well as leading design bureaus where new aircraft were created. The evacuation affected all major aircraft manufacturing centers in the European part of the country. From Moscow and the Moscow region, where a significant part of the aviation industry was concentrated, trains began moving eastward in the summer months of 1941. One of the main evacuation centers was the city of Kuibyshev, now Samara. Factories producing the famous Il-2 Storm aircraft, the flying tank that struck terror into German troops, were relocated here. Sergei Ilyushin's design bureau also moved here. During the war, Kuibyshev became the country's second reserve capital and, at the same time, its aviation capital. Another important center was Kazan, where factories producing bombers, in particular the PE-2, were evacuated. The Yakovlev Design Bureau, which created the best Soviet fighter planes, also found a new home deep in the rear. As in the case of the tank factories, production was set up in record time. Often, equipment was installed in unsuitable premises, garages, warehouses, and hangars. But within a few weeks, and sometimes even days, the factories began to produce products. The relocation of design bureaus was of enormous importance. Away from the front, in a relatively calm environment, engineers and designers were able not only to establish the production of existing models, but also to work on their modernization and the creation of new, more advanced machines. It was during the evacuation that many aircraft were refined and put into mass production, ensuring the Red Army Air Force's superiority in the air during the final stage of the war. The evacuation made it possible not only to preserve, but also to increase production capacity. At new sites, far from the bombing, it was possible to introduce assembly line production methods and increase labor productivity. As a result, despite the loss of many factories at the beginning of the war, total aircraft production not only did not fall, but, on the contrary, increased sharply. The success of the evacuation of the aviation industry is not just a story about machines and blueprints. It is a story about people. About test pilots who flew newly assembled aircraft from factory airfields directly to the front lines. Of workers who lived on the edge of starvation but assembled several aircraft per shift. Of engineers who found ingenious technical solutions under the most difficult conditions. Thanks to their joint efforts, the skies over the battlefields from Stalingrad to Berlin ultimately remained in the hands of Soviet aviation. Neither tanks nor aircraft could be built without metal. Steel was the lifeblood of the war, and the battle for it was no less important than the battles on the front lines. Therefore, the evacuation of metallurgical enterprises in the south of the country, primarily from Ukraine, became one of the most difficult and heroic chapters in the history of the rescue of Soviet industry. Unlike machine-building plants, where the main value was in the machines, which could be dismantled and transported, a metallurgical plant is a single, incredibly complex organism. Its heart is the blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, and rolling mills. These are gigantic stationary structures weighing thousands of tons that seemed impossible to move. Nevertheless, the task was set to save everything possible. The main target of the evacuation in the south was the industrial giant Zaporizhstal and other plants in Zaporizhia, such as Dnepropetrovsk and Koksokimzavod. When the front approached the city, an unprecedented operation began. The dismantling took place under continuous artillery and mortar fire from the enemy on the other bank of the Dnieper. People worked around the clock, dismantling the most complex equipment. It was decided not to transport the furnaces themselves, but rather the most valuable and complex parts: electrical equipment, control and measuring instruments, and, most importantly, the unique rolling mills that produced the thin steel sheets needed for the aviation and tank industries. The dismantling of the blooming mill at Zaporizhstal became legendary. This colossal structure was dismantled, marked, loaded onto platforms, and sent east in record time. In total, about 320,000 tons of machine tools, structures, metal, and other cargo were transported from Zaporizhia in 45 days. It was a real industrial exodus. The equipment from the Zaporizhia, Dnepropetrovsk, and Mariupol plants was sent mainly to the Urals and Western Siberia. There, on the basis of existing enterprises, such as the Magnitogorsk metallurgical plant, or at new sites, a duplicate metallurgical base was created. The equipment that arrived made it possible to quickly establish the production of the types of steel that were necessary for the defense industry. For example, the evacuated equipment from Dnepropetrovsk enabled Magnitka to master the production of high-quality armor steel. Anything that was impossible to remove, primarily blast furnaces, was rendered unusable. Before the Soviet troops withdrew, the blast furnaces were stopped up, i.e., the smelting process was halted so that all the metal inside the furnace would solidify, turning it into a useless monolith. It would have taken months, if not years, to restore such a furnace. The feat of the metallurgists who saved the heart of the industry made it possible to supply raw materials to the tank and aircraft factories that were ramping up production in the east. Without the steel evacuated from the south, there would have been no Tankograd, or aviation capital, in Kuibyshev. It was a victory in the battle for steel, which laid the foundation for the overall victory in the war. The long and exhausting journey to the east was coming to an end. But for hundreds of thousands of evacuees, this was not the end, but only the beginning of a new, no less difficult stage. Trains arrived in the Urals, the Volga region, Siberia, and Kazakhstan, places that were often completely unprepared to receive such large numbers of people and equipment. Instead of the factory buildings that awaited them, they often saw nothing but open fields, snow-covered steppes, or hastily constructed temporary structures. The relocation of the arriving enterprises was a feat in itself. Equipment was often unloaded directly from the platforms onto the ground. Assembly began immediately, in the open air, regardless of rain, snow, or frost. Around the machines that were already in operation and beginning to produce their first products, the walls and roofs of future workshops were gradually erected. This image, a machine working in the middle of a field, became one of the most vivid symbols of the labor heroism of that time. Enterprises were located on the sites of production facilities under construction or on the basis of existing factories with a similar profile. Consolidation took place. In one workshop, machines from 2 or even 3 different factories could work. But the most difficult factor was the human factor. Millions of people had to be housed, fed, and provided with at least minimal living conditions. And this was a huge problem. There was a catastrophic shortage of housing. The newly arrived workers and their families were housed in hastily built barracks and dugouts that people dug for themselves. They were often taken in by local residents who shared what little they had. Living conditions were appalling. Overcrowding, cold, lack of basic amenities, shortage of food and warm clothing. But people did not give up. Women and teenagers became the main force in these new factories. The men were at the front, and their places at the machines were taken by their wives, sisters, and children. They worked 12, 14, and sometimes 16 hours a day. They mastered the most difficult male professions, becoming turners, millers, and welders. They stood on boxes to reach the machine controls. They were undernourished and sleep-deprived. But they met and exceeded their quotas because they knew that every shell they made, every part for a tank or an airplane, was their contribution to victory, their help to their fathers and husbands who were fighting at the front. This was the second, rear front, and the battle there was no less fierce. It was a battle against the cold, hunger, fatigue, and incredible hardships. And in this battle, the Soviet people, especially women and children, showed miracles of fortitude, patience, and self-sacrifice. Their labor feat, accomplished deep in the rear, on the banks of the Volga, in the Urals, and in Siberia, became as important a component of victory as the heroism of the soldiers on the front lines. They did not simply survive in inhuman conditions. They created a new, powerful industrial force that ultimately broke the backbone of Nazi Germany's war machine. The deployment of evacuated factories in new locations and the launch of production in the shortest possible time became a real economic miracle that stunned the enemy and largely determined the outcome of the war. The pace at which Soviet industry relocated to the east began to produce goods seems incredible even today. On average, enterprises began production in their new locations within a month and a half to 2 months after the arrival of the last echelons. Some record-breaking factories managed to start production even earlier. This incredible leap forward was the result of a combination of several factors. First, it was the unparalleled enthusiasm and self-sacrifice of people working at the limits of human capabilities. Second, it was the well-thought-out organization of the evacuation itself, in particular, the principle of preserving the completeness of equipment, which made it possible not to waste time searching for and selecting machine tools, but to immediately start assembling entire production lines. Third, it was the mobilization power of the planned economy, capable of concentrating all resources on solving one main task. By the spring of 1942, When relative calm had returned to the front after the Battle of Moscow, the results of this titanic effort became apparent. Industry in the East was not just up and running, it was rapidly gaining momentum. The German command, confident that the Soviet economy had been undermined and was unable to make up for the colossal losses of equipment in the first months of the war, was shocked. As already mentioned, when intelligence reported to Hitler that 1,000 Soviet tanks were being produced per month in the East, he dismissed it as disinformation. The real figure of 2,000 tanks seemed simply fantastic to him. The enemy could not believe that a country that had lost its main industrial centers was capable of such a feat. They underestimated the viability of the Soviet system and the resilience of its people. The restoration of production was not just quantitative. In evacuation, far from the front lines, design bureaus were able not only to restore, but also to improve military equipment. New, more powerful tanks, aircraft, and artillery systems were put into serial production at factories in the Urals and Siberia. By 1943, by the time of the decisive battle at the Kursk Bulge, the Red Army had not only quantitative but, in some cases, qualitative superiority over the Wehrmacht in terms of equipment. And this superiority was forged right there, in the rear, in factories that a year and a half earlier had been nothing more than a pile of machine tools brought in from thousands of kilometers away. This phenomenal leap forward took the enemy completely by surprise and laid the material foundation for a radical turning point in the Great Patriotic War. The operation to evacuate industry, which at first seemed like a desperate move by the retreating side, turned out to be a brilliant strategic move that allowed the USSR not only to hold out, but also to gather strength for future victories. When discussing the evacuation, it is impossible to ignore the figure of Joseph Stalin. His role in this process, as in the entire history of that period, is extremely controversial and provokes fierce debate. On the one hand, he bears direct responsibility for the fact that the country was not prepared for such a turn of events. His refusal to consider plans for a preventive evacuation in the spring of 1941, his famous resolution demanding that talk of evacuation be stopped, all this led to the first, most critical weeks of the war being spent in chaos, wasting precious time and resources. This short-sightedness, born of self-confidence and distrust of intelligence reports, cost the country dearly. However, on the other hand, when disaster struck, it was the system of rigid, centralized power that he had built that made it possible to carry out this grandiose operation. With the creation of the State Defense Committee, GKO, headed by Stalin, all power in the country was concentrated in one set of hands. The GKO and the Evacuation Council created under it acted as a single mechanism, whose decisions were not subject to discussion and were binding on everyone, from commissars to factory directors and railway station managers. Stalin personally supervised the evacuation of the most important facilities. His archives contain memos reporting to him on the removal of specific enterprises and the amount of equipment, grain, and livestock that had been transported. He delved into the details, made demands, punished, and rewarded. His name and his iron will were behind many decisions. The methods used to achieve results were typical of Stalin: harsh discipline bordering on cruelty, reliance on fear, disregard for human life and living conditions. Victors are not judged. This principle was central to his system of management. The main thing was the result. The factories had to be moved and put back into operation at any cost. and that cost was enormous. But in the conditions of that war, a war of annihilation, perhaps only such a system could have worked. Analyzing Stalin's role, historians come to different conclusions. Some see him as a brilliant organizer, an effective manager, who, at a critical moment, was able to mobilize the country and save it from inevitable defeat. Others emphasize that he himself created the crisis with his pre-war policies and then overcame it through the incredible and ruthless mobilization of the entire population. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Stalin was neither a genius nor a villain in the pure sense. He was a product and creator of his era and his system. This system, based on centralization, planning, and coercion, demonstrated its monstrous but, in those specific conditions, effective mobilization power. The evacuation was its highest manifestation. It was an organizational feat accomplished under a dictatorship, and Stalin, with his dual role, was at its center. He was both the architect of the crisis and the chief engineer of the Great Project to overcome it. The main, most massive and dramatic stage of the evacuation took place in the summer and fall of 1941. However, it would be a mistake to think that the process ended there. In the summer of 1942, after the crushing defeat of Soviet troops near Kharkov, German troops launched a new large-scale offensive. This time, their main target was not the center of the country, but the south. Plan Blau envisaged the capture of oil fields in the Caucasus and access to the Volga River in the Stalingrad area. This new threat required a second wave of evacuation, less extensive than in 1941, but no less important. Now it was the industrial and agricultural regions of southern Russia that were under attack. The Rostov, Voronezh, Oryol, and Stalingrad regions, as well as the North Caucasus. The experience gained in the previous year made it possible to carry out this second wave in a more organized manner, albeit under equally difficult conditions. Time was catastrophically short, and the front was rapidly approaching. Nevertheless, in the summer and fall of 1942, equipment from more than 150 large industrial enterprises was successfully transported from the frontline areas of the South. Once again, trains carrying machine tools, material assets, and people headed east. The evacuation from Stalingrad was of enormous importance. When fighting was already raging on the outskirts of the city, the most valuable equipment and skilled workers continued to be transported out of its factories, primarily the Stalingrad tractor plant. At the same time, the factories continued to operate, repairing tanks and producing goods for the city's defenders. The evacuation from the North Caucasus was aimed primarily at saving food supplies, agricultural machinery, and oil equipment. It was necessary not only to prevent the enemy from capturing Caucasian oil, but also to preserve equipment so that production could be quickly restored at other fields. This second wave of evacuation, although smaller in scale than the first, made a significant contribution to strengthening the country's economic potential. The rescued enterprises and resources were immediately put to work for the front. They helped to compensate for losses and support the buildup of military production at the decisive moment of the Battle of Stalingrad. This was another successful strategic operation, another race against time won by the Soviet rear. It once again demonstrated the flexibility and mobilization capabilities of the Soviet system, which, having learned from the bitter experience of 1941, was able to more effectively counter new challenges. The rescue of the productive forces of the south of the country in 1942 was an important addition to the industrial foundation that had been laid in the East a year earlier and brought about a radical turning point in the war. The relocation of productive forces to the East was one of the greatest achievements of the Soviet people during the war. According to Marshal Georgy Zhukov, this grandiose operation was equal in strategic importance to the greatest battles of World War II. And this was no exaggeration. It was the evacuation that created the economic miracle that allowed the country not only to survive, but also to win the most terrible war in human history. By 1943, by the time of the turning point in the war, the industrial landscape of the USSR had changed dramatically. Despite the occupation of territories where a third of all industrial production had been carried out before the war, the total volume of military production not only did not fall, but actually increased significantly. Industrial production in the rear areas, in the Urals, the Volga region, and Siberia more than doubled compared to pre-war levels. In 1942, during the most difficult period for the country, Soviet industry produced 25,500 aircraft and 24,500 tanks, significantly more than Nazi Germany. In 1943, this superiority became overwhelming. This economic miracle came at a price, and that price was incredibly high. It was measured not only in money or tons of equipment transported. The main price was human lives, and the incredible, beyond human limits, strain on the entire population. People worked without days off, 12 to 14 hours a day, in unheated workshops, barely eating. The labor feat of women, old people, and teenagers who stood at the machines is beyond description. They sacrificed their health, their childhood, and their lives for victory. The evacuation saved industry, but it also created enormous social problems. Millions of people, torn from their homes, lived in the harshest conditions, in barracks and dugouts, suffering from cold, hunger, and disease. It was a quiet, invisible war for survival that the home front fought every day. Nevertheless, the result of this sacrifice was evident on the battlefields. By the time of the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, the Red Army had a powerful, smoothly functioning rear. The flow of tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition coming from the east grew with each passing month. The Wehrmacht, on the other hand, was no longer able to replenish its losses to the same extent. The economic duel was won by the Soviet Union. Thus, the evacuation was not just a rescue of industry. It was a profound strategic operation that changed the course of the war. It allowed time to be gained, forces to be regrouped, an indestructible military-industrial fist to be created in the deep rear, and ultimately material and technical superiority over the enemy to be secured. The price of this achievement was enormous, but the alternative was defeat and the destruction of the country, and the people paid that price in full. The Great Patriotic War ended in victory in May 1945, but the legacy of the Great Evacuation, this unprecedented operation in history, lives on today. Its consequences proved to be much more long-lasting than simply securing victory in the war. It radically and permanently changed the economic and demographic map of the Soviet Union. Before the war, the country's industry was mainly concentrated in its European part. The evacuation created new, powerful industrial centers in the Urals, Siberia, the Volga region, and Kazakhstan. Cities that had been small or medium-sized before the war, such as Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, Kuibyshev, and Omsk, turned into giant industrial metropolises. After the war, some of the equipment and people returned to the liberated territories, to rebuild the destroyed factories. However, many enterprises and millions of people remained in their new homes. The evacuation gave a powerful impetus to the development of the eastern regions of the country. New cities were built, roads were laid, and energy and social infrastructure was created. The Urals finally established itself as the supporting region of the empire. Siberia began to transform from an agricultural region into a major industrial and scientific center. This shift of productive forces to the east was of enormous strategic importance in the post-war period during the Cold War. Industry, spread out over a vast territory, became less vulnerable to potential attack. The evacuation left a deep mark on the historical memory of the people. It became a symbol of resilience, unity, and labor heroism. In many cities of the Urals and Siberia, there are monuments to the workers of the home front and evacuated factories, reminding us of those heroic days. Stories about how machines were started up in the open air and how women and children forged victory at the machine tools are passed down from generation to generation. On a global scale, the Soviet evacuation of 1941-1942 remains a unique and unmatched example of organization and logistics in extreme conditions. No country in the world, either before or since, has ever moved such enormous industrial power over such distances in such a short time while at war. It was a quiet but decisive battle, one not on the battlefield, but on the railways, in factory workshops, and in the hearts of millions of people. It was a battle for industry that won the war for the very existence of the country. The legacy of this battle is not only factories and cities, but also an example of the incredible mobilization of the human spirit in the face of mortal danger.